Hello, this is Brian Cheatham. This is the first Get Cloud Savvy video blog. I don't know if that's what you call it in the blogging world, is a vblog, video blog, whatever it is. Anyways, this is a video, and in this video we're covering Okta versus Azure AD as an identity provider. So what we've done is we've built a lab environment that has both a Okta federated domain and an Azure AD managed domain. And we're going to look at the different scenarios, or what we call activities in this particular blog, of users doing certain things, what it looks like from an Okta perspective, federating, where you're actually logging in through the Okta interface, and then what it looks like just on the Azure AD side to see that tighter integration on the Azure AD side of things. So let's go ahead and get started. So just to kind of set the stage here a little bit, I put just a diagram, a Visio diagram together to show you what we have set up in this lab environment. So basically we have both Okta and we have Azure AD Connect. So if you see off here to the right hand side, we have Azure AD Connect, which is synchronizing from a Active Directory domain services. This is actually running in Azure, so it's a Active Directory domain services running in Azure, not Azure AD. And that's our mastered copy. And we're synchronizing those objects one way to Azure AD Office 365. And then we have Okta in the picture too. So we have the Okta AD agent, which does the synchronization, and it also does delegated authentication. So we have an identity provider here in Okta, and then we also have an identity provider here in Azure AD. So if you notice here, we've got an Okta sign-in page. This is our Okta federated domain. So anytime that you see this domain throughout this demo, you'll know that's an Okta federated domain. And then we have a Azure AD managed domain, what we call an Azure AD managed domain. So that's our this domain here. So, and then we'll see the regular sign-on page. So notice we don't have to go through any third party for authentication. We can actually go directly to this Azure AD component as an IDP. I probably should have put IDP under here rather than just software as a service, but I did identify it as identity as a service. That is what Azure AD Premium provides you, and that comes with the Microsoft EMS E3. So let's move on to the activities that we're going to cover in this particular blog. So what we want to do is we want to look at several different activities, what we're going to call activities. These are end user activities. So this is from an end user perspective. We're going to look at all of these activities from the perspective of a user logging in via an Okta federated domain and an Azure AD managed domain. So we're going to look at things like the initial sign in to the portal. What does that process look like for both? Trusted and non-trusted sign-in. So trusted sign-in meaning that we're coming from a corporate network. We're coming from a PAD address or some sort of external IP that Okta and or Azure AD recognize as a corporate type of network. And then we're going to look at the Outlook profile creation or configuration. And then we're going to look at the risky sign-on from a Tor browser. There's several other risky sign-on type of scenarios that are out there, but just for simulating the risky sign-on and how to block that, we're going to use a Tor browser. And then finally, we'll look at the Azure Mobile Application Management enrollment and sign-in. So we're going to look at a mobile device and how that process works through both an Okta federated user and an Azure AD domain join. Azure AD managed domain. And then we're going to look at restricting applications to corporate owned devices. So that's where we get into Azure domain join, or Azure, what they call Azure AD join, and then Azure hybrid Azure AD domain join. So actually synchronizing those computer objects that are added to a domain to Azure AD. That's an Azure AD type of scenario. That's something that Okta doesn't support. So we're going to take a look at all those different activities, and let's go ahead and get started and take a look at our first activity. So the first activity is the initial sign-in. So signing into the applications portal for Okta and for Azure AD users. So we got two different examples here. So we're going to start with our first demo. And this is going to be the sign-in process for the initial sign-in for an Okta user. This is an Okta federated domain. So I'm going to launch an incognito web browser. And I'm actually going to type in the URL that I have for this Okta instance. I could actually customize this if I wanted to have my own customized domain name here. Okay, so here's our first sign-in page. And in this case, I have a user named Orlando Okta. Very creative with the naming here, even with the domain name itself. So this is a scenario where I have an on-premises user that is synchronized using an Okta agent out to Okta, and now I'm signing into the cloud Okta system. It's the first time that I'm logging in, so I need to set some additional parameters here. I'm not going to specify a secondary email address. Least favorite food, we'll just say liver. I actually don't really mind liver, but I'm just typing in something to have it. I definitely want to add a phone number here. So a code was sent to my cell phone. I'm going to type in that code. If I can get the right dialogue here. And I lost the code. 79537. There we go. Verify. Okay, so I added my phone successfully. Now it wants me to select a picture. We'll just stick with the top picture here, and we'll say create my account. Okay, so now I'm looking at the Okta applications portal. Notice how I have all of my Office apps. These are automatically provisioned for me in the Okta interface. So both Okta and Azure have this capability. So Okta and Microsoft My Apps portal is what we call it. So we're going to look at that in the next example. So for now, I'm just going to log out, and we will move on to the next scenario. Our next scenario is the initial sign-in to the Microsoft My Apps portal. So this is going to be a different user and a different domain for that matter that is not federated with Okta. It's actually managed by Azure AD. So the link for My Apps is actually myapps.microsoft.com. There's my sign-in page. And my Azure AD user is Adam Azure, another creative name for you. Enter the password. And again, this is an on-premises user that has been synchronized to Azure AD via Azure AD Connect. So not the Okta agent in this case, but via Azure AD Connect. Okay, notice how it didn't ask me to set up my multi-factor authentication, or actually I really didn't set up multi-factor authentication. I just added a phone number. So there were a few more steps to configuring that profile. But if I wanted to, once I logged in here, I could actually come in and update my profile information. So a little bit different than the Okta process, but we will see here how I have the same type of look and feel. The Okta interface, as far as the portal is concerned, is a little bit more mature than what the My Apps portal offers. You can group some of these applications into different groups, kind of like you can on like an iPhone or something like that. So these features are actually coming as part of My Apps in future releases. So Microsoft is diligently working to increase the functionality of this. But as you can see, these are very similar to the two. It just, to me, this looks cleaner just because this is a Microsoft application sitting within a Microsoft portal. Okay, so that's the difference between the Okta
Applications Portal and the My Apps Portal with Microsoft. So I'm going to sign out here, and we're going to close this browser and go back to our presentation here. And our next step is to look at a trusted Outlook web app. So we're signing in to Office 365 Outlook on the web from a trusted network. So this would be a network where we are in a corporate facility. We're within a corporate boundary that is protected by a firewall or deemed safe to our corporation. Our first test is going to be with an Okta federated user. So we're actually going to sign in directly to outlook.office.com. I'm going to launch a incognito window again. And we'll go directly to outlook.office.com/OWA. There's my initial sign-in page. So this is the Okta scenario. So we're going to log in as the Okta user here. Yep. My creative names are getting the best of me. They're not really that creative. Notice how I get redirected to the sign-on page. So because it's federated, the sign-in page for Office 365 is directing me back to Okta for sign-in. Now, I'm not an Okta certified consultant. I don't claim to be one. This is a lab environment that I set up just to understand the differences between the two. But one of the things that I've noticed here is that I have to type in this username a second time. Now, there's probably a way to preserve that via a session, a cookie, or maybe even a fancy way with a URL, or maybe the way the user accesses this. But in this case, I'm having to type this in again. Dev US. And this is the first time I'm signing into this mailbox, so I'm presented with this nice little wizard. I'll just leave it at Pacific time. I'll just select something random here. Let's go with crayons. I'm not going to add a signature right now. We just want to get logged in, and we want to see our mailbox and maybe send a message. So let's go. Okay, come in here and I'm just going to send a quick message. I'm going to send it actually to myself. Yeah, and there's my message that came through. Okay, so that's the Okta experience. So it's a federated scenario. We go to the sign-in page for Office 365. We're redirected back to Okta for sign-in. We sign into Okta, and then it's a federated, it's actually called WS Fed, is the type of authentication that we're using for single sign-on to Office 365. So we're not actually passing any kind of password or anything like that. It's a token exchange. So let's sign out, and let's look at our Azure AD scenario. Advance our slide here one. So this is the Azure AD user sign into Outlook web app from a trusted network. So let's launch a incognito window and do the same thing. Go to outlookoffice.com/OWA. And in this case, I'm using Adam Azure. Enter my password. Notice how I didn't get redirected anywhere. I'm signing into the same system. It's all the same backend. So notice how we weren't redirected. Yeah, Azure AD is actually the underlying directory for Office 365. So we're actually signing into that directory that Office 365 sits on top of. So let's go through our initial wizard here. It's interesting how it looks a little different this time. Let that finish. All right. And we'll do the same thing and just send us a test message just to make sure everything's working properly. There's Adam Azure. There we go. So that's basically our difference between the Okta sign-in process and the Azure AD. So for Okta, really the difference is that we're federated for the domain that we've selected. So we get redirected to Okta for authentication. Once we're authenticated, then it's a single sign-on process via WS-Fed to Office 365. Whereas Azure AD, we're just signed in because Azure AD is the underlying or the foundational directory for Office 365. So let's move on to the next activity. So now we're talking about a non-trusted login. So a non-trusted network, somewhere outside the corporate network. Maybe you're at a Starbucks, maybe you're somewhere else, maybe you're at a customer's conference room on guest Wi-Fi somewhere. So how can we use per application, what we call application conditions, to enforce multi-factor authentication? So for Okta, those are called sign-on policies and they're configured per application. For Azure AD, we call those conditional access. And we're also going to talk about what would happen if we had an Okta user which was included in both. So it's an Okta user that's included in a sign-on policy as well as a conditional access policy in Azure AD. So we'll see the combined experience between the Okta sign-in policy and the Azure conditional access, just to show you how these technologies can step on each other if you're not careful. So let's move to the first scenario, which is going to be our Okta federated user signing into OWA from a non-trusted network. So I'm basically simulating this just by putting the user in a group. Typically, this would be done with what we call a trusted network setting. So whatever the PAD address is on your outbound router, the external address, so the address that is actually exposed to Office 365 and or Okta, depending on which identity provider you're using. So we'll sign into our Okta user first. This is where we're getting redirected to the Okta sign-in page. I'm having to type this in again. I keep forgetting my my very creative domain name. And notice what happens here. At this point, it recognizes that I'm a member of a certain group, so it's sending me to the multi-factor authentication setup because I've never used multi-factor authentication before. So we're just going to do SMS authentication. Let's send the code. Make sure I've got this in the right area here. Verify and sign in. And we're logged in. And it's interesting that it's making me go through this again. Okay, and there's our original message that we sent. That kind of shows you the experience with multi-factor authentication on the Okta side of things. So how about on the Azure AD side? Close out. Advance the slide. In this case, we're looking at an Azure AD user sign in to Outlook web app from a non-trusted network. So we're using conditional access for this. So this is a per application setting. We could actually apply this to multiple applications if we wanted to. And our Adam Azure. Oops, that's the wrong domain name. I gotta get this right. I'm sure everybody out there who's a fast typer is like, wow, this guy really types slow. You're right, I do. And here's the multi-factor sign-in for Azure AD. So I'm going to set up now, direct it to a different page here. Not as clean as the Okta process, to be honest with you, but it still gets the job done. So put my phone number in here. And I'm such a good typer, as everybody can tell so far. I'm going to send a text code. I could have it call me if I wanted. I could also use an authenticator app, just like I can do with Okta. So very similar functionality between the two. And type in my verification code. Let's see, 211. Okay, verification was successful, so click done. Okay, multi-factor authentication was done. And now we're signing into Outlook. And it was interesting that I got forwarded back through the wizard at the beginning. I'm wondering if it saw it coming from a different, maybe it saw it coming from a different IP or something on the Okta side of things as far as sign-in was concerned. That's very interesting that I had to go through that process a second time on the Okta side. So that's the Azure AD experience. So let's sign out of this now and let's look at an example where a user could potentially be assigned both. It's an Okta federated user that's basically added to a sign-on policy and conditional access for the same application that would require multi-factor authentication. So I'm going to launch an incognito window. Same thing, log into Outlook. I probably should make a bookmark for this, but you guys already know I can't type, so I think we're good there. My user, I actually copied this one because I couldn't remember off the top of my head what it was. So I basically have a user that's Joe Okta Azure, so it's actually assigned to both. So I'm going to say next. It's going to take me to my sign-in page. Same thing, I just paste that in here. It's the Joe Okta Azure. Okay, it's the first time that I've signed in, so I'll go ahead and do this. The same thing that we had before, just so I don't forget. Add my same phone number. Send code. Verify that. Looks good. Set a picture. We'll just set the same picture. And off we go. And notice how it says, okay, you're trying to sign in to an application that requires multi-factor authentication. So in this case, I'm going to set up SMS authentication. I just need to send the code because I've already provided. That's interesting. Oh, I got to provide the phone number. See, not only do I not know how to type, I don't know how to read. Okay, type in the code. And let's see what happens here. So I'm verifying this, and this is going to send me now to Office 365. And look at this. Because I'm also involved in conditional access on the Azure AD side, I also have to provide multi-factor for the Azure AD side. So this is what can happen in these environments where you mix these technologies. Microsoft can do all of this for you, so just kind of keep that in mind when you're looking at these scenarios. Azure AD conditional access actually has a lot of options, more options compared to what the Okta sign-in policy provides you. So if you are an Okta federated user or you have an Okta federated domain and you want to use conditional access, you can use it this way. Just make sure that you're not stepping on top of your different policies aren't stepping on top of each other. So I'm verifying. So I went through 2 verification processes at this point. And we're done. Yes. And finally, I'm signed into my mailbox. And it's the first time sign on. I'll go ahead and go through this real quick just so we have it. I don't think we use this user in another demo. Actually, you know what? We might use it later on for another scenario just to show you how these technologies can step on top of each other. Okay, so let's sign out here and move on to the next activity. So let's move on to our next activity, which will be Outlook profile configuration. So let's look at the profile configuration for an Okta federated user and one for an Azure AD managed user. So our first scenario is an Okta federated user. We're creating an Outlook profile for an Okta federated user. So I'm going to launch a VM here that I have hosted in Azure. And I just have, this is just a workstation scenario. It's not joined to a domain or anything like that. So it's just a workstation login. So I have a local user set up on this Windows 10 system for this user. Okay. Okay, so we launched Outlook. We're going to type in our email address, our federated email address. And watch what happens here. We're going to Exchange Online to see, hey, where is this account going to authenticate against? Since it's federated, it's going to go back to Okta. And this is where we should see the Okta sign-in page pop up. And there's our Okta sign-in page. Can't believe I'm remembering all these usernames or not remembering them. Okay, so it is a multi-factor scenario again because I'm simulating that with a group. I haven't removed it from that group, so I'm going to send the code to my cell phone. So that's signing me in. So look here, it's asking me, do I want to add this account to Windows? So what this basically means is, do I want to add the token that I've generated, the credential for that token, I guess you'd say, to the local credential manager in Windows? So we can still do things like remember password for Outlook in a workgroup scenario. So I'm not going to set up a mobile phone at this time. I'm just going to click OK. And it'll see that we are now logged into Outlook. Okay, so this is the first time that we've launched Outlook or any Office application for that matter. So we need to activate. So let's see what the activation process would be like on the Okta side. I'm going to type in my email address. It's a subscription-based license. So we need to authenticate. Notice how it's sending me back through the Okta process for sign-in. And still sending me back through multi-factor because that's how I have it configured on the Okta side for this particular application. And this should complete my activation process for Office. Okay, so that is our sign-in process, or our first time setup for an Outlook profile for an Okta federated user. So now let's look at the scenario where we have an Azure AD user, an Azure AD managed user, signing in to a workgroup scenario and setting up an Outlook profile. All right, this is an Azure AD user creating an Outlook profile for the first time. And this is a workgroup scenario. I'm logging into a Azure virtual machine that's running Windows 10. And I just have a local user for Adam Azure. Okay, there's our desktop. Let the spinner stop spinning. There we go. Oop. Getting my domains mixed up again, as usual. So this is the account name, the email address. These should match anywhere possible to avoid end-user confusion. And notice what happens here. I don't get redirected. It's a kind of an integrated experience. The dialog that pops up here is actually a Windows 10 dialog. It's not a web page or anything like that that is asking me for authentication. It's built into Windows. So let's type in our Office 365 credentials. We're logging into Azure AD at this point. And this is interesting. I must have set a different default because it's actually calling me for multi-factor. So I'm going to go ahead and complete this here on my phone. You have to press pound. And there you go. And also I get the same question if I want to add this account to Windows. So again, all we're doing here is we're just adding the token that was generated, the access token as well as a refresh token. I believe it's the refresh token that actually gets added to the local credential manager. So that credential is actually good, or that token is actually good for 14 days. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the upcoming demo. So it's registering the device. That just means that it's incrementing the count because you get up to 5 copies of Office that you can install on your different systems as part of the subscription-based license. Okay, we're not setting up a mobile device. We're just saying okay here. I probably won't get asked for activation in this case because I've already activated this copy with another user. So we went through that process on the Okta side, but it'd be something similar on this side. I have a feeling though that the locally cached credentials would actually keep us from having to type anything in because it is an integrated experience. But either way, if we were asked for authentication, it would be much the same process that we just went through. So that is your Azure AD Outlook profile creation from a workstation computer. So let's move on to the next activity, which is risky sign-on. So we want to sign in via Okta or via an Okta federated user from a risky sign-on type of scenario. In this case, we're going to use a Tor web browser just because this is an easy scenario to demonstrate. Other risky sign-ons would be in possible travel scenarios. You log in the States and then you try and log in Australia 5 minutes later. Other things would be leaked credentials to the dark web. Microsoft has a cybersecurity team that is cross-referencing that information for you to where if any way, shape, or form your credentials or your user's credentials are leaked, they're making those cross-references to the accounts that you have within Azure AD. So I'm not an Okta expert. I'm not an Okta certified consultant. I don't know how the Okta backend works with risky sign-on. But this is one of the advantages as I see it from my perspective with using Azure AD over Okta. So we're going to look at just the base configuration for Okta, and then we're going to look at the base configuration for Azure AD, engaging that risky sign-on type of conditional access. So let's start with our Okta scenario. So this demo is an Okta federated user with a risky sign-on attempt to Office 365 or Outlook web app via a Tor web browser. So let's take a look here. Launch our VM that we have in Azure, and I have a Tor browser installed here. So I'm going to launch the Tor browser. So now we are in a Tor browser, which is basically masking the IP. We call it an anonymous IP scenario. So I'm going to log in to, let's just go to Outlook. .office.com/OWA. Let's increase our real estate a little bit here. Sorry for the refresh delay. The Azure VM I selected is one of the lower tiered VMs. So we're going to start with our Okta user. As soon as our refresh is done. Okay, and this process is taking me to my organization sign-in page, which is going to be Okta. There's our Okta sign-in page, so let's sign in here. Yep, gotta type the right password. At this point, we should get redirected to provide our multi-factor authentication code. So send code. Wait for it to come through on my mobile phone. And there we go. Now notice what happens here. I'm automatically redirected to Office 365. And there you go. I actually logged in via a Tor web browser, so I'm coming from an anonymous IP, logging in to Office 365 via Okta. So actually that sign-in was possible for me. And again, there is probably a way for Okta to lock down this type of activity on their back end. I'm just using, again, the base configuration for Okta in my lab environment. So let's look and see what happens with an Azure AD risky sign-on attempt, where we're actually telling a conditional access policy that we do not want to allow that. We want to block that. Okay, so for this demo, the Azure AD user, it's a risky sign-on to Office 365. In this case, we're using Outlook on the web, using a Tor web browser. So let's launch our VM with the Tor browser. Okay, so this time I'm going to leave the Tor browser in this kind of unmaximized state because it seemed like the refresh was a little better. So let's go to outlook.office.com/OWA. Okay, here's our sign-in page. And this time we're logging in as Adam Azure. Should prompt us for our password. I'm sorry for the delays with this. Again, this is a one of the lower tiered Azure VMs. Here's my password. Because I have two different conditional access policies, I have one for multi-factor, require multi-factor, one on a non-trusted network, and I have one for the sign-in, the risky sign-in criteria. I'm automatically blocked. So your sign-in was successful, but it does not meet the criteria to access this resource. So the conditional access policy itself in Azure AD is blocking me from doing this. So that's kind of the difference between the Okta experience and the Azure AD experience for a risky sign-on. Now, the Tor web browser is probably something that Okta can address, again, on their back end. But you also have other things with risky sign-on that are advantages for Azure AD, such as the impossible travel scenario. There's also the leaked credentials. There's a whole list of risky sign-on attempts that Azure AD will detect automatically. Identity protection policy or in a conditional access policy. So let's move on to the next scenario. So for the final activity, we want to look at restricting applications to corporate devices. So say we want to restrict SharePoint Online to only corporate devices. You might want to restrict other types of applications based upon the device. And specifically when we say corporate devices, we're talking about a device that is Azure AD joined. Windows 10 has a new feature called Azure AD joined. So joined to the domain and marked as compliant in Intune. Or consider hybrid Azure AD domain joined, which are computers that are members of on-premises Active Directory domains, which are synchronized. The computer objects and certificates for those computer objects are actually synchronized to Azure AD, so you can use them in conditional access. So Microsoft Intune and Azure AD conditional access allow for this type of configuration. Let's compare the Okta federated experience with an Azure AD experience. And on the Okta federated side of things, we're not going to use conditional access. We're going to show you just what Okta is limited to with their sign-in policies per application. Whereas on the Azure AD side of things, we're going to show you the conditional access portion, which engages that functionality to look for things like Azure AD domain join or Azure hybrid Azure AD domain join. Okay, so let's take a look at the demo. This is Okta federated user accessing SharePoint Online from a non-corporate device. So this is something that we don't want to happen, right? We want to restrict users from accessing SharePoint Online. So we're looking at only Okta functionality here. The only thing that's engaging at all on the Azure AD side of things is the token exchange or the access to the SaaS application SharePoint Online and Office 365. So let's take a look at our demo here. Launch our Windows 10 virtual machine as our Okta user. Okay, I'm going to go straight to the web. And I'm going to type in the SharePoint URL. So notice how the sign-on screen here is a little bit different this time around, because remember when we configured our Outlook profile before, we actually connected that account to Windows. So Okta in this case is really nothing more than an authentication point. We actually have a refresh token in the background that's leveraged with Azure AD. But for purposes of this demo, we're trying to demonstrate how we can restrict access to a certain application. So if you notice here, once I click, I'm actually taken directly into SharePoint Online, and this is something that we don't want as part of our simulated corporate policy. So let's take a look at how Azure AD handles this without any kind of Okta involvement. So this is the Azure AD user accessing SharePoint Online from a non-corporate device. So really the same scenario we just looked at, but this time around we're using all Microsoft functionality. So we're going to launch our Windows 10 VM as our Azure user. And here we go with my typing skills again. And again, we're going to go straight to the web browser, and I'm going to try to access SharePoint Online. And right away, I'm told that I can't do this. Your department is ensuring that this device is up to date with your organization's corporate policies. So this is an example of device compliance. This could also be an example of we have to have a domain joined machine, or we have to have an Azure AD joined machine. So this is one of those advantages of using Azure AD conditional access over Okta's sign-in policy for applications. So we really have the capability of drilling down to the device level And because everything is a Microsoft technology, it integrates a lot better as far as controlling what we can access per application on the type of device that we're using, what group we're in, or what location we're coming from. So we have a lot more capabilities on the conditional access side of things with Azure AD, and Microsoft continues to add to this functionality.
All right. In summary, we covered quite a bit in this blog video. So we covered the different scenarios: Okta, federated domain, or an Azure AD managed domain, the initial sign-in to the portal. We saw how we were redirected to Okta to sign in. So anytime that we're signing in to that federated domain, we are redirected to Okta. Trusted and non-trusted sign-in to a web application. We used Outlook Web App in this case. So trusted and non-trusted from an Okta federated domain and from an Azure AD domain. So you got to see that process where you're redirected to Okta again in that case. Outlook profile configuration. We saw how it was a little bit more of an integrated experience on the Microsoft side, but not much difference between the two. You're just redirected to an Okta authentication page to authenticate against Azure AD via WS Federation. And then risky sign-on. We noticed how Okta didn't pick that up by default, and just by configuring a conditional access policy on the Azure AD side of things, the Tor browser scenario was actually picked up. So Okta probably has a way to address this, but Microsoft has other things that it does with risky sign-on too. We talked about the impossible travel scenario. We talked about the anonymous IP, which is the Tor browser. The leaked credentials, that's a big one too, right? The cybersecurity team from Microsoft actually looking for credentials on the dark web and correlating those to the ones that are in Azure AD. So that's something to think about whenever you're making a decision between Okta and Azure AD as an identity provider. So it's something you can definitely bring up with your Okta representative to see if they have anything that's coming out on their roadmap. Again, I'm not an Okta expert, or I'm not Okta certified or anything like that. I'm just doing a comparison between the two. And then finally, the restricting of applications to corporate-owned devices. So we showed you how we can actually do that with, we have more capabilities around the Azure AD side of things for that. So thank you so much for joining. This is the closeout of this blog, and there will be more to come. I really appreciate everybody hanging in there with me on this blog. If you have any questions or anything like that, please comment. Please let me know if there's anything else you would like to see in a video blog, any kind of scenario that you have out there that you would like me to lab out and demonstrate for you. And thank you again. This is Brian with Get Cloud Savvy signing off.